Well, I'm Professor Giovanni Santamaria, Associate Dean of Academic Operation at School of Architecture and Design at New York Tech. And on behalf of the Dean, Maria Perbellini, I would like to welcome our guest lecturer, Neil Leach, tonight, and all of you that are assisting in person and on Zoom connected also for this wonderful presentation. And I now leave the word to the chair of our lecture and event committee at the School of Architecture and Design, Athena Papadopoulou, who will introduce and say some words about the overall series and the next appointments, right? And we will proceed accordingly. Welcome.
Hello. As the chair of the lecture and events committee, I'd like to briefly introduce the lecture series theme. So our theme for this year is Future by Design. So new AI tools allow for design experimentation, but also raise questions regarding new forms of agency and knowledge transfer in design. Intelligence is not only embedded in the computational tools one uses to design and make, but also in matter itself. Embedded smart systems in products and environments facilitate communication and enhance interactions, making matter responsive to individual needs. Questions of control and privacy arise that future designers must tackle. In addition, the urgent matter of climate change forces designers and scholars to rethink materials, manufacturing, and production processes. Our 2023-24 lecture series reflect on current and future challenges in design, practices, and research, questioning existing models, imagining desired modes of creation, and highlighting the social responsibility of the designers of the future. So I'd like to welcome Professor Tom Verebes in the School of Architecture, who will introduce our speaker. And please keep in mind that next week, Thursday at 6 p.m., we'll have our next speaker, who will be talking about biomaterials and biodesign, Orkan Delhan. So, Tom?
Thank you, Athena. Thank you to, Associate Dean Santamaria, to Dean Perbellini for support for launching this series, and also for tonight's lecture. Thank you to Athena Papadopoulou and the Lectures and Events Committee for all the hard work, together with Sue Sternberg, to make this series come to life. This lecture is also sponsored by the MS in Urban Design program, directed by Marcella Del Signora. So on behalf of Marcella and I, it's an honor to introduce Neil Leach, who is an architect and professor originating from the UK. He currently directs the Doctor of Design program at Florida International University, FIU, and he's also taught in several schools, including the Architectural Association, Harvard GSD, Columbia GSAPP, Cornell, IAC, and SCI-Arc. Together with Philip Yuan at Tongji University in Shanghai, Neil's the co-founder of Digital Futures, an online educational platform that operates globally in 10 languages. Neil is a former researcher for NASA, where he developed 3D print technologies for the Moon and Mars, and a member of the Academia Europaea, Europe's leading academy with over 50 Nobel laureates. Neil has published over 40 books on architectural theory and digital design, translated into 8 languages. This outstanding, prolific cultural production is, I believe, unique and perhaps unprecedented in architecture. He's currently working on artificial intelligence. His most recent books include Architecture in the Age of Architectural Intelligence, An Introduction to AI for Architects, published by Bloomsbury in 22, and a guest-edited issue of AD, co-edited with Matthias Del Campo, titled Machine Hallucinations, Architecture and AI. In this lecture, Brain City, AI-enhanced city of the future, Neil asks important questions such as, what will the city of the future look like? Will it look strikingly different from cities today? Will it look like something out of the Jetsons, complete with flying cars and space-age buildings? Or it will look much like our contemporary cities with a few new buildings, but with much of the existing building stock retained and simply retrofitted with the latest AI technologies? In other words, will the primary driver of change be a language of novel architectural forms? Or will it be the introduction of ever more sophisticated AI-based technologies? Neil's presentation takes the latter approach and explores the use of AI-enhanced information systems are likely to give rise to the brain city of the future. perhaps moving a little bit off script, the paradigm of brain city is a provocative one. Organizationally, brains and cities are both complex multi-agent systems in which both neurological and urban interactions and exchanges have immediate parallels. And this paradigm holds the promise of the possibility of autonomous intelligence as the basis for creating sentient spaces. Along with other urban theorists and authors in this current era, also writing on AI, Neil Leach is somewhat aligned to authors such as Antoine Picon, Mario Carpo, Areti Markopoulou, Carlo Ratti, Shannon Mattern, amongst others, all of whom also understand the impact of AI and the Internet of Things as most likely involving advanced technologies with great capacities to be grafted upon the existing scaffolding of the fabric of infrastructures of cities, rather than creating a wholly new form of urbanity. To engage with this rapidly evolving technological and cultural context, Neil has posited the information architect, whose focus is on reimagining existing infrastructures in cities through software, and the retrofitting of cities with distributed sensing and actuating apparatus. As the debates surrounding the so-called smart cities rage, with proponents claiming newfound efficiency, safety, comfort, and security, countered by alarm over the specter of surveillance by governments and corporations, Neil brings clarity and insight to these polarizing debates. Personally, I view Neil Leach as one of the leading contemporary theorists in architecture and urbanism in general, and also one of today's preeminent experts on the implications of AI for architecture and urbanism in a time of accelerated advancements of AI technologies. It is indeed an honor and a thrill to introduce tonight's lecture. Join me, please, everyone, to warmly welcome Neil Leach.
I'm not sure you live up to that. Hernandez Alonso tells me that LA doesn't mean Los Angeles, it means late again. So we're running a bit late. And I think that New York City is probably the primary place that needs to get AI controlled traffic, I'm going to say. What I'm going to do today is to kind of sum up a trajectory that has been looking at the question of intelligence since I was a colleague of Tom's at the AA years ago, and more recently, my book and speculating into the future. The book is about to come out in a second edition. Tom actually asked me not to mention. 1 second. Can I go forward? Not able to. We'll just try clicking on that. Okay, Tom asked me not to mention buildings. I'm not going to mention buildings, but oh, hold on a second. I'll do that. I'm mentioning it just simply to, by way of saying, well, I'm not going to talk about. And I think when most people think about AI these days, they think of this kind of thing. These are just Mid-Journey 5.2 images that I've been generating. And I think a lot of people think that AI means that. It means that, or ChatGPT, and so on. But actually, what I'm particularly interested in are the systems behind these, what are so-called large language models, and their behaviors and what they imply for the future. And I also think that these images that we're seeing, which do have something very interesting about them. I mean, and I'll mention that briefly shortly, but I think this is not really what AI is going to do for us. I mean, this is just simply what Patrick calls ideation, Patrick Schumacher. You can kind of brainstorm possibilities very quickly using this tool, and it comes up with a range of options that you wouldn't otherwise have thought about. But it's problematic in other ways. These diffusion models are very difficult to control and so on. But I think really what's going to happen, the real change is going to happen in about 2 or 3 years' time. People like Guan Yu He of LookX or XCool are working on software that's going to radically transform the way that we operate as architects, completely change the design process. Everything's going to be fully automated. Everything's going to be on a single platform rather than the moment. The discrete operations that you have, you might go from Mid-Journey to Maya to Rhino to BIM and so on. It's all going to be on a single platform. And embedded into that is going to be a series of checks and constraints to make sure that you're not contravening building code or planning permission and so on. It's going to keep a check on cost, on structure, on environmental control systems and everything. And that's, of course, going to be make a radical change because it has implications further down the line. But ultimately, that's what it's going to be. And it's not going to be so sexy, frankly. It's going to be like, I guess I would say, spell check writ large. It'll be controlling and making sure that, that everything's performing in a certain sort of way. So these are just a kind of prelude to say what I'm not talking about. What I want to talk about is essentially information, intelligence, and really to try and delve deeper into what are the long-term implications of this. Needs to run their course. I'm essentially, this is going to be a kind of a speculation, shall we say? And I don't think there's any wrong with speculation per se, especially when you're trying to compare something like AI with the way that the brain operates, because both are effectively black boxes. We really don't know how either operate. We know they operate, but we don't know how they operate. And as such, we can't, with any sort of scientific method, really interrogate this field with any rigor. And in fact, the world of science is a bit stumped also by some of the other terms I'm going to be talking about, such as emergence. We can see emergence at work, but science is struggling to understand how it operates and what it means. Having said all that, then, I think there's still a role to be played for speculation in that many things have been said in advance, prediction, shall we say, about the future, and have proved to be very insightful. So I want to start off with Arthur C. Clarke, someone who came from the UK. Actually, a lot of this came from the UK. Alan Turing was obviously from the UK. Many of the figures, Geoffrey Hinton's from the UK, Demis Hassabis, and so on. It's a curious sort of background. So this is Arthur C. Clarke. So let me, for those who don't know him, he was a kind of futurist scientific writer about science and science fiction writer. And he was involved in the movie advising on 2001: A Space Odyssey. And this was a comment he made from 1964, which was astonishingly prescient. So let me just play it. I think it was interesting that he talked about, is this depressing? There is a dark side that he'd already noticed, that because in 2001: A Space Odyssey, as you probably know, the supercomputer turns against humans. And of course, we're now discovering the dark side of AI as well. And for those of us working in the field, even for those working in the field, this was a big surprise, ChatGPT. Obviously, there have been signs that something was going to be very impressive coming out, but nobody quite predicted what this device would be able to do. It's exceeded expectations, as indeed I would say has Midjourney and DALL-E and LookX and so on, and exceeded them in a way that has caused a bit of alarm. And here you can see many of the kind of the comments that have been made in the last few weeks, months about AI. The concern about how the lack of regulation could be disastrous. This letter that was that Elon Musk signed, and then figures such as Geoffrey Hinton and Yoshua Bengio, who worked with Hinton, getting concerned about precisely how capable it would be. And then, of course, the general public also becoming alarmed about AI. And indeed, of course, we've had Hollywood script writers and actors concerned that they would lose their jobs, and so on and so on and so on. So all of a sudden, there is something else that is emerging. I don't think that AI is evil. It's just a tool. And like a kitchen knife, for example, you can use it to cut up your vegetables, or you can murder someone, but you can't blame the tool. No kitchen knife has been convicted of a crime. And AI, I think, is like that. But it is, I would say, it is incredible. And I think it's terrifyingly incredible, frankly. The more I engage with it, the more I get concerned about this. And I want just to bring to your attention something that is not mentioned in an architectural discourse, something that doesn't sound very interesting: large language models. Actually, they're not large. They're absolutely gigantic. These things are based on trillions of parameters and bits of data and so on. They are absolutely enormous. And this is what we should be talking about. This is the GPT behind ChatGPT, because these are the things that are really, I would say, alarming people by just how capable they've proved to be. So the letter that you probably heard about, The Future of Life, Max Tegmark from MIT and his team put this out, calling for a halt until they could somehow introduce some safeguards, was precisely because of these large language models. And if we go to the bottom of this paragraph, there's a sentence here that you probably would skip over, where it refers to the stepping back from the dangerous race to ever larger, unpredictable black box models with emergent capabilities. What does that term emergent capabilities mean? Well, what it means basically is that these systems, although they've not been trained, have learned languages. They've learned to translate different languages. They've learned to write code and God knows what else. And this is, we had some sense that this was going to happen from AlphaGo Zero, that taught itself to play Go without being taught the rules of Go. So these things have got these astonishing so-called emergent capabilities. And I just want to sort of mention briefly the term emergent, which really lies at the heart of all this. John Holland, the first ever PhD actually in computational science ever, wrote this book on emergence back in the 80s, I think it was. And it's an interesting phenomenon. And more recently, the book by Stephen Johnson, The Connected Lives of Ants, Brains, Cities, and Software, that was published the day of 9/11, and Stephen Johnson is based in New York. The term emergence is really, it's something super intriguing. And what is interesting about emergence is we can see examples of emergence everywhere. But as John Holland comments, we can't explain it. No scientist can explain it. And it's not that it's seemingly magical, but it's not magical, because magic doesn't exist. Certainly if we follow Arthur C. Clarke, magic is simply what science has yet to explain. And certainly a magician doesn't do magic. It just does a trick. He or she pretends that it's magic by not disclosing the operations that are at hand. But the term emergence, I'm going to talk more about this later, because this is sort of central to what I'm working on at the moment. But we can see little manifestations of this everywhere. This is in Brighton in the UK. You can tell because it's so gloomy, and where I used to teach. And these are the starlings, the murmuration of starlings as they come in to roost in the evening. And this, of course, is beautiful. It's delightful. And what this is an example of a kind of bottom-up operation, where the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. And it's completely unpredictable. It, as it were, takes on a life of its own. And that's precisely what they're referring to when these large language models start developing these capabilities that cannot be explained, but somehow they acquire them. In some senses, they're a bit terrifying because they're so unpredictable. So I want to talk a little bit about this guy, first of all, Geoffrey Hinton, who is the godfather of AI, no question. Geoffrey Hinton is from the UK. He's the great-great-grandson of George Boole of Boolean geometry fame. He actually studied architecture for 2 days at the University of Cambridge. In fact, he actually had, well, I think he realized before that, because he spent the summer working in an architectural office, that architecture wasn't for him. And I think it took him 2 days to work out how he could transfer to natural sciences, but he did that. And He then eventually did a PhD in Edinburgh, and he came across this side of the Atlantic, but not to the States, because he was disturbed by the fact that MIT and others were all working on military-funded occupations. He went to Toronto in Canada, and he was totally convinced that really the way to get towards AI was through neural networks, through understanding how the brain operates. Now, neural networks have been completely out of favor. AI was coined in '56, and for the first 50 years or so, neural networks, although they've been working on them early on, they were out of favor because they weren't working. In fact, Marvin Minsky wrote a book with a colleague trashing them, and they were absolutely out of favor. And Geoffrey Hinton and his team, in order to get any paper published, had to scrub any reference to neural networks, to connectionism, to what is now called deep learning. But then around 2000, when suddenly GPUs appeared and computers became far more powerful and much faster, and other things like cloud computing kicked in, all of a sudden, these things worked. And the first 50 years, they had really achieved very little. 2006, the founders got back together again, and they had nothing to show. And they had predicted there was nothing they could do in the future. But suddenly, neural networks started working, and they are behind all these things, ChatGPT and so on, and they are absolutely astonishing. But Geoffrey Hinton recently, as you've probably read in the papers, stepped away from Google in order to voice his concerns about these large language models and what they're capable of. So let me just play you Geoffrey Hinton being interviewed. So just to explain, the reference to a joke was, I mean, it was in Palm, is that it was able to explain a joke, and therefore, for Hinton, it could understand the joke. So therefore, it can understand. The question of thinking, this is why I agree with Geoffrey on almost everything he says, but I think we have to use the word inverted commas for thinking. And the real danger is because we use terminology, that's the terminology we use for human beings, we tend to anthropomorphize this domain. And that's the risk. the big issue he's talking about basically is the fact that nobody, well, at least when I wrote my book, I made the comment that AI has got no more capacity to think than your pocket calculator has. I mean, it didn't. And we were convinced it wasn't going to do that for some time. It now is reaching the point where certainly if ChatGPT knows 10,000 times more than a human being, then clearly it has got some kind of form of intelligence. In my work, I use the expression alien intelligence. One of the things when AI first, well, when I wrote my book, about 2 or 3 years ago now, if you ask most people what AI was, they probably think it was a robot. Now possibly think ChatGPT. But the point is, we were then surrounded by AI without us fully being realizing it on all our devices. I mean, AI is what filters out your spam on your email. It finishes off your sentence on Gmail. It locates your friends recognizes your friends on Facebook. It translates on WeChat, and God knows what else. It's doing all these things, but because it's basically it's software. I mean, AI is just simply algorithms. It's not a robot. Because of that, it's actually invisible. So we weren't aware of the fact that we were surrounded by AI. And I made this one comment in my book, which is interesting. It is as though the Earth has been invaded by an invisible, super intelligent alien species. And I like the word alien, and I'm increasingly using that term alien in order to kind of like to prevent people from anthropomorphizing AI. We are not talking about intelligence the same as human intelligence. That's Geoffrey Hinton's point, basically. It is a form of intelligence, albeit not the same as biological intelligence, but is way, way superior. And with Moore's law, and we are racing ahead with these large language models much faster than Moore's law right now, it is going to get increasingly intelligent. So in a few years' time, it'll be a billion times more intelligent than human beings, at least according to Mo Gaudet. What this means basically is that we have to recognize that we are not the center of intelligence in the universe. And the way I see AI is a bit like the way that, maybe those of you who've got dogs, the dog has a greater sense of smell or hearing than human beings. It can smell or hear things that we can't at all smell or hear. And I think this is going to happen very soon. We've already seen that in the AlphaGo incident, where AI was able to operate in a way that we just simply couldn't understand. It was beyond our comprehension. So this is another person I think that is almost certainly right. I just want to play this, Yuval Harari. I don't know if you've read my book, but anyway, it's nice that the term alien intelligence has been used by other people. In a few weeks' time, I'm going to go on a round the world trip, a lecture tour, and I'm going to be in Warsaw giving a lecture, which of course, Nicholas Copernicus was from Poland, and the central thesis when I'm presenting there is that we have to go through a second Copernican revolution and realize that not only is the Earth not the center of the universe, but we are not the center of intelligence in the universe. We have to recognize that. And I think the real problem in some senses has been that we have looked at AI and judged AI according to our attributes. And we say, well, it's not conscious. It can't do these things, can't do that thing and whatever, Well, what if we turn that round? What if we were AI looking at human beings and realizing how stupid human beings are, right? And, I don't necessarily think we need consciousness. For example, Yuval Harari has a comment that he makes about a Google car that was crashed into by a human-driven car. Now, Google cars, self-driving cars will get better and better and better. They'll become more and more reliable, but human beings will never stop being distracted. I don't know why that human car driver crashed. Maybe he or she was checking a phone or whatever. We need to recognize, in other words, that there is an entity out there that is very, very different. The second comment that I also agree with, Yuval Harari argues that AI has hacked the operating system of human civilization, by which he means it has learnt to write. And once you can write, then you can persuade people, you have enormous power, and so on. I would argue on top of that, that it's actually learned to design. Alongside these other emergent capabilities, it has learned to design. I don't know how many of you have used Midjourney, but it's all based on prompts, right? And these prompts can be quite extensive. My prompts are about 70 words long. They're quite long. But they refer to things like the lighting conditions, the hyperrealism of the image, the rendering, and so on, and so on, and so on. The actual references to architecture are very, very limited. In this particular case, it was ultra-contemporary minimalist house in the Austrian Alps. I didn't say what it had to look like. That was done by Midjourney. Nor did I say anything about the mountains and the valley in the background. That was all designed by Midjourney. And the grass and the boulders in the foreground, that was all done by Midjourney. Midjourney designed this. Or this kitchen, for example. I didn't mention there's going to be a painting on the back wall. It's actually quite a nice painting on the back wall. I didn't mention the plant outside and whatever it is outside. I didn't mention the coffee maker at the back or the taps or whatever. It just generated all this automatically. Or indeed, it has a sense of tectonics, how materials come together. I didn't specify anything, but it made this fairly convincing villa. Or indeed these reflections. Pretty astonishing. And these were done in 3 seconds. Just for those of you who haven't used these things, these were done in 3 seconds, which is also pretty astonishing. With that kind of prelude, I want to sort of, in a way, track a certain trajectory that in some ways picks up on Tom's own career, because many of these ideas started off when I was teaching at the AA with Tom back about 20 years ago now. And around that time, well, first of all, this book here, the Swarm Intelligence, had come out in 1999. It was produced by 3 European researchers at the Santa Fe Institute in New Mexico on swarm intelligence. This came out the day of 9/11. And then this is a book that I produced with Roland Snooks, came out in 2017 on swarm intelligence. And when I was teaching at the AA, everyone was talking about, all my students were writing about emergence. This was what really got them excited. And you know, this, I've shown you a flock of birds before, and I just want to just add a few things to this. What is happening here basically is that these birds are following a set of very straightforward and basic rules. Keep going in broadly the same direction as the birds around you, and keep a certain distance from them and go at the same speed. But out of that, something emergent appears that is greater than the sum of the parts. It just emerges. But importantly, if you're a bird in that flock, you don't know about that. All you do is know about the birds all around you. You can't have any external perspective on the astonishing aerial acrobatics that are going on. But this is the principle of swarm intelligence. And it doesn't matter on what the entities are. It could be other entities. As long as there is a multi-agent system, the bigger the multi-agent system, the more that it operates. Maybe I should sort of say, with the large language models, they are not very sophisticated in terms of their code. It's like 200 lines of code. It is the simple size of them that caused this kind of emergent phenomena to appear. And you can see this in swarms of fish and so on. It's a natural phenomenon, as it were, in natural systems. And you can see possibly an architectural articulation of this certainly in traditional housing building stock. This is on an island in Greece, where you can see that kind of they're following the contours of the land, and they're abutting one another and so on, keeping to that same kind of logic. And this is Marrakesh, very similar. And there are many, many other examples, favelas in Rio and so on, of architecture that's following those logics. Also, with the logic of emergence, you get the logic of pheromone trails, where ants in particular are developing emergent forms of behavior. and the collective behavior of something like a slime mold. So the slime mold fascinated people, scientists, because it's actually made up of thousands of cells that come together as a single entity and go foraging for food, but behaves in a very strange way. And there have been experiments trying to work out and to understand this. This is a study of the metro system in Tokyo, where they're using slime mold to see, and little pellets of food to see whether it starts finding pathways and so on. And you can see it kind of withering off the left because there's no food there, and eventually forming dominant pathways. This is actually about as intelligent as swarm intelligence gets. And of course, it's completely missing the point in some ways because there are rivers and roads and things that it's overlooking. It's a very simplified and reductive map. But nonetheless, this is what we began to see with swarm intelligence. And the challenge really was that swarm intelligence was never really very intelligent. You can see this kind of principle working with the way humans operate. I took this on a flight back from Beijing one day, and you can see a road at the top that is kind of obviously designed by engineers. But these emergent pathways are ones that are basically begin to appear when people start following each other, following pheromone trails essentially, and they're developing their own pathways. There was a famous case of a professor of biology who had a building constructed, and but he told the landscape guys to hold on until they knew what people were wanted to do, and then one frosty morning, they realized the kind of tracks that people were making, and they laid out the landscaping to form that thing. So that you have the difference here between the top-down imposition of the engineered road and the bottom-up appearance of these pathways. So what about the kind of computational side of things? This is the work of Craig Reynolds, who in the early 90s started developing what he calls boids to try and model the flocking behavior of birds. And what is interesting about this is actually the bird experts, the ornithologists or whatever they're called, had no clue about how or why birds would flock. But Reynolds was able to reverse engineer it and use this as a computational tool to explore how they would operate. And from then on, there were a number of architects. This is the work of Roland Snooks, then with Kakuja, now professor at RMIT in Australia, where he was using this logic. And of course, we have processing, but actually Roland wrote his own algorithms, where you can see these emergent pathways that are continually mutating. So they're not fixed in any way. They're continually mutating, developing. This led to a series of studies for urban plans and things that we incorporated in the book Digital Futures. And then more recently, his work has been looking at how you might use swarm intelligence to go and to develop designs. This is a mace, a ceremonial mace for RMIT that was 3D printed out of titanium, and then other sort of studies that he'd been doing. And this is the way, in a way, that the architects were using the world of swarm intelligence to produce novel designs. And then, just as for Tom, this is something I think was produced when Tom was at Hong Kong U. Roland and I put together an exhibition in the Hong Kong U Study Center with a book that didn't come out for a while later, an exhibition of all this work. And and I guess we were looking for something. We were looking for a form of intelligence, something out there. And Casey Rees was also part of this. And I think all the people who were working on swarm intelligence are now working on AI, because now we're seeing something that is genuinely intelligent, that is producing some novel forms. I'm sure that Tom recognizes these people. So this is the kind of work that Kakuja produces, or used to produce, which looks a bit like this, which of course is the point behind Stephen Johnson's book, The Connected Lives of Ants, Brains, Software, and Cities. Right or wrong. But the point is, actually, it might look like that, but actually it behaves very differently to that. And in some ways, the limitation of this is it was just simply form, and it's called complex form, but it's not exactly complex. In fact, if you look at a more traditional or uniform form, like a soap bubble, the kind of complex interactions that cause this to morphogenetically generate itself as a sphere are far more complex than the very basic algorithms used for processing. There's also a bit of danger in the sense that you kind of freeze things. I mean, processing actually continues forever, and you kind of freeze things just to get a building or a design and such. And this is kind of similar to really to what happens in AI. This is what I think is the very, very first GAN-generated design that was done by Refik Anadol. Interesting, in 2019, I teamed up with Patrick Schumacher and ZHA and also with Refik, and we were sponsored by Google. And the idea was we were going to curate, we were going to do the British Pavilion at the Venice Biennale. We didn't get shortlisted. 2019, it was off the radar completely. But Refik went ahead anyway and did what we were planning to do, and that is to say, to hallucinate. That was the term we used at the time, to hallucinate a building. And so he fed into the computer all the data he had, all the designs of Zaha Hadid Architect, and eventually it produces something that looks like a Zaha design. Even though Zaha's no longer with us, it was able to generate something that looks as though it could have been designed by Zaha. And in a second, you will see that one image appearing out of the computer. And that was the image that we used on the front cover of of my book that came out in December 2021, in fact, in the UK, but later in the States. And that was a state that we thought that was amazing, right? But it was freezing it. It wasn't really, it was just simply a frozen thing, a bit like processing. And likewise, later on, Deep Himmelblau, Corp Himmelblau was working on more sophisticated, that was style GANs. And this is cycle GANs, where you're working with two unpaired data sets, and they begin to also use the data from their office and try and extrapolate, because you're no longer interpolating, you're extrapolating. It's actually increasing the range of options of other possible buildings that could have been designed by the office. And this was the state of the art until diffusion models came along. So, and it produced some relatively good images. We used one on the front cover of the AD, machine hallucinations. But my point is that is really missing the point. Right? If you just freeze a process, you're missing the kind of the workings of the operation itself. More interesting, I think, is someone like kind of Kevin Kelly, who tries to use some of these logics to understand how the economy works in a totally out of control, bottom up way. And I think that is really capturing the essence, I think, of what swarm intelligence could have to offer. So let's come to the city of the future. And the question that Tom asked earlier on is, what will the city of the future look like? Will it look like something out of the Jetsons, some kind of science fiction model of a completely new world, or will it look more like what we might have today? And this is LA, you know. And I think, like most cities, New York included, there's little scope for building. I mean, much of the space has already been worked on. I imagine that most of the work of architects will be refurbishing existing buildings in the future. And really what's going to happen, frankly, is the existing building can be retrofitted and treated as digital twins. So you'll be able to use AI to monitor the performance and so on. But basically, it'll remain pretty much the same. But the city itself will be completely controlled by AI. In 2009, I produced, I guess edited another issue of AD on digital cities, which was interesting at the time. Tom was part of it. Interesting because all the architects thought, well, okay, what is it going to look like, the city of the future? And we had all these designs, including this one by Zaha Hadid Architects for Istanbul. This was going to be the city of the future. And in fact, all the architects pretty much sort of took that line. This is what it's going to look like. And of course, none of this has happened. This was a study for Singapore. This was a study for the east of London. None of this has been built. We don't actually have a digital city as such. But by contrast, to my mind anyway, the most interesting essay in the book was that by Ben Bratton, who called his article iPhone City. And what he basically argued is basically AI or iPhones or computation basically is changing our cities more than any building form. It's changing the way we navigate and understand our cities. And this is kind of a bit dated because he was talking about how you can work, the car can become the office and you can carry on working when you're stuck in a traffic jam in LA or I guess New York as well. But what he did this was 1 year before Uber came out. And I think this is an important kind of point because what Uber tells us basically is that really it's not about new forms. The city of the future is not going to be based on new forms. It's going to be based on new informational systems. So Mario Carpo gets it completely wrong when he says, oh, there's going to be a new architectural style of big data. And he read somewhere that big data was messy. So he looks at some designs coming out of the Bartlett and says, that's the style of big data. No, actually what's going to happen is that basically the form is not going to change at all. I mean, is an Uber car different to an ordinary car? No, because it is an ordinary car. It's the mode of operation that is so different. So what I'm suggesting basically is what we're talking about in the future is not form, but information. Informational systems and formations that come out of the informational system will be the things that will be dictating where we'll be going on in the future. He also throws in this kind of weird comment. I'm not quite sure why he said this, but it's kind of interesting, where he basically calls upon half of the architects to stop doing what they're doing, and instead to invest the historical depth and intellectual nuance of their architectural imaginations into the design and programming of new software that provides for the better use of structures and systems we already have. It is a simple matter of good content management. The other half, the control group, they continue as before. In other words, he's talking about a kind of information architect. And I think this is a term we need to engage with increasingly, and not just BIM. Of course, we've got BIM, but to go way beyond that in terms of gathering data and generating designs based on data. This is some work from Jana Bogosian's students at Columbia, 2004, a few years ago. This is the work of Shan He, who's an MIT graduate who then went on to work for Uber, tracking the kind of the Uber vehicles in London. And I think this is the important point of how we need to be approaching urban design these days in terms of data mining and using analytics to understand the behaviors of our cities, because that is, I think, the way that we're going to be going. The city of the future is going to be based on information and informational systems and not on form itself. And as architects, we also become informational architects. So that brings us to the notion of the informational city. The term was obviously used before by Manuel Castells, and Ben Bratton takes that further, but in his essay about the stack, what he calls the accidental megastructure of the stack, where there are different layers of operation. He three-dimensionalizes the notion that Castells has put forward and understands these particular layers. I'm not so sure I would see it in those three-dimensional terms myself, but it's important that he basically opens this up. The question that he asks, though, is, I mean, the question really that is being put out there is, well, we have smart cities. Isn't that what you're talking about, really? Well, the problem about smart cities is they're operating in very discrete ways. There's no interconnectedness, no ambient intelligence that is shared between these different systems. And as such, they don't kind of come together and operate in the same way. What I want to suggest, though, is that there is a way forward whereby we could use AI in terms of, and it is being used, frankly, as a way of making our cities operate in a coherent way. There have been a number of people in the past who've looked at the question or looked at the comparison between cities and the brain. Peter Singer, who's a very distinguished neuroscientist from Germany and a friend of Wolf Briggs. Wolf Briggs did a project based on the brain of the city with his students. But he basically would be talking about this, and he is very serious about this. I'm not convinced myself by Stephen Johnson's model, where he shows what a brain looks like and what a city looks like and said, well, there you go. That's not enough, I don't think. But nonetheless, there is something interesting because it is in the title of the book itself, Emergence, the connected lives of ants, brains, cities, and software. And I would say that we're already connecting cities and software very well. How do the brains fit in? So I just want to just mention in brief, this is John Holland, who wrote about this. And he kind of was remarking on basically how cities somehow can maintain themselves despite these devastating swings, as he puts it, being shortage and glut. And somehow there's a way in which the city has an intelligence that allows it to maintain its stability. And he compares the city, like the to water, the standing wave in front of a rock in a fast-moving stream, like that. The city is a pattern in time. Even though the molecules of the water are changing the whole time, nonetheless, the form maintains itself. What we need to bring into the equation then is the question of neuroscience, and to think about what tools we can develop from neuroscience that might give us some sense of how that might operate. This is Antonio Damasio, Portuguese neuroscientist, currently at USC, one of the most famous neuroscientists in the world, and someone that I collaborated with because I was teaching in USC. A bit conservative perhaps, but he has a notion of homeostasis as being a fundamental to how culture evolved and how everything evolves. And it's not homostasis, it's not kind of static, it's similar. So it's not the same, it's similar. And it's about this kind of loose model about how everything is kind of based on a kind of feedback loop that is in the end trying to maintain this condition. In other words, the brain is not the command control center. It's rather, it is a kind of balancing device that's preventing us from getting too excited or too lethargic and so on. It is, in a sense, balancing it. And this homeostasis for him is a fundamental aspect of how the brain operates. Now, interestingly, within the world of cybernetics, they were also looking at how the theme of the homeostat. This is the work of William Ashby, who was one of the early kind of cybernetic neuroscientific thinkers who wrote about the brain, and he developed this model with the homeostat, which he thought by having this kind of feedback loop would be able to model this particular kind of condition. Interestingly, Damasio did not know about the writing of Ashby. Now, Alan Turing, strangely, heard about this and wrote to William Ashby and said, well, can I lend you my ACE, his early protocomputer, to work on this kind of field? And he makes the point that he's not so interested in the possibility of I'm more interested in the possibility of producing models of the action of the brain than in the practical applications to computing. And when you think about it, what a tragedy this guy, you probably know the story. He was in 1951, he was convicted of lewd acts. He was caught as a homosexual, and in 54 he committed suicide, presumably as a kind of indirect result of that. But he was working on all sorts of things. This is a reaction diffusion model that he was the first to talk about. I don't know what the connection between diffusion models and reaction diffusion models are. That's another question. But Alan Turing was someone also pushing that area. And if you look at some of the AI people today, I mentioned obviously Geoffrey Hinton, who was interested in the brain and connecting to AI, but there are other people like Demis Hassabis, who's in charge of DeepMind, the CEO of DeepMind, who did a PhD in neuroscience before becoming an expert in AI. And there's also people like Anil Seth, one of the world's leading neuroscientists, who did a PhD in AI before he worked in the world of neuroscience. So there's that world between neuroscience and AI, I think, is one of intriguing one. They're coming together. And in the end, the concern is about intelligence and trying to understand how intelligence operates. So how does it relate to the city? Now, I don't know if this is convincing or not. This is City Brain. I mean, I've read their kind of promotional material where, of course, they're very convincing or trying to sell themselves. But nonetheless, there is something interesting about the kind of thinking behind this. They basically, there is a big debate about whether the brain is more like a computer or the internet. And I cover this in my book, and I simply say that he buys into the notion that there is an internet. It's more like the internet. And he develops this notion that the smart city could be described as he developed the city brain so I'm talking about brain city, but he's talking about city brain, and the technique that they use, and there's a little to show because it's all this kind of like screenshots of things, is basically that what they're doing is using AI as a digital twin. So digital twins are going to be very, very important in the future. We are going to have our own personal digital twins. They're going to be used for buildings in order to monitor in real time the performance of the building and using the power of AI to resolve the problems. And also cities themselves will be relying on these digital twins. So in real time, you're gauging what's going on. Of course, in China, no one's quite so worried about surveillance. You can do that the whole time, and cities are going to be controlled by this. Now, according to the promotional material that City Brain put out, they're basically able to get rid of traffic jams. That's why you need some in New York. They're able to spot accidents before anyone's reported them, and so on. And this is a kind of way that is really improving all the traffic in the cities in China. And they even make this comment: cities are learning to think. Now, I mean, I guess you've got humans in the loop, so in any case, there is a sense in which you're dealing with consciousness in some level. But the question ultimately is whether or not, once you've got a model with so much data being fed in and using AI in a coherent way, whether these are themselves going to operate a little like large language models and actually take on emergent capabilities. That becomes the kind of question. Whether cities are going to think, I mean, how we use this term think, I personally say I would put inverted commas there. But certainly, I think that cities will will be seeing patterns emerging and things emerging out of this research that will quite surprise us. So I'm just going to finish off with two speculations about what the future might bring. And I don't think there's anything wrong with speculations, even though they're completely speculative speculations. I want to start off by saying that the moment. I mean, increasingly all my Uber car drivers are using Teslas, and you get a sense. What is happening already is that when you're driving in this Uber, you know exactly what is around you. Let's go. Okay. This should actually have been cool. I must apologize. So okay. Think back at two slides. This is Elon Musk. So what my comment is basically what we're going to get once you've got a city that already is sort of, let's say, thinking or has a certain intelligence, according to logic of swarm intelligence. If you add AI to it, then you are in a sense enhancing it. And this is a comment that Musk makes that basically, I mean, we've always thought about AI versus humans, but really what's happening is that AI becomes an extension of the human. And we increasingly are using it as a kind of prosthesis to increase our capabilities. There was a discussion back in the 90s. David Chalmers, who's NYU, and Andy Clark were talking about how we already have a kind of extended mind, and we can use notepads and things. And of course, we have these devices that, of course, become an extension of ourselves. We keep our phone numbers there. We don't memorize them. So we're extending ourselves. And what's happening with AI is more a form of extended intelligence or intelligence augmentation, so that we are becoming cyborgs. And Andy Clark has got a book out called Natural Born Cyborgs. Human beings adapt to these new tools because of the plasticity of the brain, and we are able to in a sense, supplement our own intelligence with this. So Elon Musk's comment, you have a machine extension of yourself in the form of your phone, your computer, and all your applications. You are yourselves superhuman. Going back to the model of the city can be enhanced through AI. So the existing intelligence, low-level intelligence, could be enhanced, and we could talk about a super intelligence of the city itself. So my apologies if that slide was out of order. So going back to this kind of question, so when you're driving your Uber, you're very much aware of what's happening. And in fact, there was deliberate policy by Uber to, before everything was ready, to get drivers to go out there, and they're collecting data. What is so interesting is that each of these cars are collecting data, and they are learning from this whole process. But there's something intriguing to my mind about the fact that actually what we're getting is something a bit like a flock of birds. It's a bit like a flock of birds in the sense you're keeping a certain distance and you're operating in a certain sort of way. My speculation is going to be that we might even start beginning to see forms of emergent behaviors coming out of this interaction, just as you get out of a flock of birds. Alongside that, there are other technologies. This is life score. I'm kind of mindful that Tom's father was a musician, and there's a guy. I forget his name, Philip. He's a British guy who is part of this company, who is a musician. And they have developed, you can see on the right-hand side, their clients. So in the future, if you buy an Audi or a Bentley, you're going to get this life score in it. They're developing a system whereby when you're driving, the music is there, and it's a bit like the homeostatic principle. You know, if you're falling asleep, it's going to recognize that, it's going to stimulate you, right? And if you're getting too aggressive, it's going to calm you down. So no more road rage, hopefully. But also, it's apparently going to change depending whether you're going to turn left or right or going up a hill or whatever. The music that's going to go with it is going to be completely based on that. So I don't know if you put this together with the kind of this idea that maybe we're getting some and kind of emergent formations that are going to come out of this kind of very orchestrated, shall we say, world. Might this lead to a actually something kind of beautiful in its own sort of way? So while we don't necessarily, it's not about beautiful form anymore, it could be beautiful formations or mutations. I mean, one thinks about how Deleuze talks about the city as a space of flows, and how maybe that is the way we need to think about the city in the future. Once you get rid of traffic problems and everything is coordinated, maybe with some music to enhance it. So let me just see if this is going to play. Probably now. Try this one. Maybe this will be louder. Good class. I guess you'd have to be flying above in a drone rather than the traffic to be able to see this thing. But that's my sense that maybe we're going to see some interesting patterns of formations that are going to be appearing coming out of this kind of world. Speculation 2. Well, what I find intriguing, I mean, I was brought up in the UK, right? And Douglas Adams was studied at Cambridge like me, and Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy was really the book we all loved, right? What is intriguing in that story is there is this massive supercomputer called Deep Thought. Now, and you can't help thinking it's a bit like the large language models, right? But the big difference is this, basically, is that in the Hitchhiker's Guide, it takes 10 million years to find out the answer to the meaning of life, the universe, and everything. And of course, the answer is 42. I'm kind of speculating that these large language models are really decoding, understanding what it is to be human at a deep, deep level. And I'm sure they're going to come up with something kind of not so different in some senses. Of course, the problem was, and this is why Elon Musk thinks that Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy is really a book about philosophy, is that they hadn't worked out what the question was. So they then go back, I think it takes 9 million years to go and find out what is the question. And the answer is like 6 times 8, or what is 6 times 8? Anyway, the big difference between this and the world of ChatGPT is that it doesn't take 10 million years to come up with the answer. It takes 3 seconds. I don't know, thinking back on Arthur C. Clarke and his kind of, well, should we worry about all these things? Should we panic in the context of Geoffrey Hinton and all those other people who are concerned about the rampant abilities of AI? Maybe we should just follow this. This is on the back page of I'm sure Tom's read this book, right? Don't panic, or in a very British way, keep calm and carry on. But I just to sum up, I think we're an extraordinary moment in history. Extraordinary moment in history where things I never imagined are happening. They are obviously affecting society at large. They're affecting our cities, and they're affecting our profession of architecture. I don't think we can. It's a tricky balance as to whether you think there is going to be a dark side to all this or not, and we don't know for sure. All we know is that the only certainty is there is no certainty. Or to use an expression used by Norman Foster, the only constant today is change. The world is changing, and I think we need to adapt to be part of that sort of world. If we don't, we're going to be left behind. And we're going to be left behind anyway. So with that, I will leave it and open up to questions. I hope that wasn't too long.
Thank you, Neil. Thank you so much for the great lecture. And I think we have a lot of inputs to, for our students, for us, and we're gonna open for questions. I have a question, but I will first open up to the audience. Yes? Athena? Yes.
I'll dare to make the first question. Thank you so much for the insightful lecture and science, also the dark side of AI, but keep calm and so on. I was curious to hear your thoughts on the following. I was reading the other day on New York Times. There was this article questioning whether AI could have like true intelligence. Whether AI can be truly intelligent without having a body. And I liked how you made these connections with cybernetics and so on. And I was wondering, the models of emergence and were based on these models of like ants and physical dynamic systems. And then cybernetics were also very much physical, like based on the idea of the brain, which is like very physical and kind of making all these robots with the sensors and interacting with the environment. And then this model kind of faded out when AI dominated, which is very kind of immaterial and language-based. And so
I think it's not working.
it's working. But can you hear me?
But the other people can't on Zoom, right?
Yeah. No. Okay.
Maybe ask from here. Yeah, that's probably yeah.
Okay, it's kind of a long question, but so I was saying regarding AI, I was reading the other day on New York Times an opinion article wondering if AI can have true intelligence if it doesn't have a body. And Neil Leach's lecture today, kind of referring back to cybernetics, which is very physical and embodied, and kind of like thinking of intelligence as the actual brain and how it can have like sensors, actuators, that kind of really this kind of intelligence that comes from the body, exploring the world. And as humans, we develop a lot of intelligence through embodied interaction. And so AI is very much immaterial. It's like based on a language model. So it's also like the city as a brain. Is the brain the internet or the brain, as you mentioned? So this question, I guess this distinction between the intelligence as kind of material and embodied based and intelligence as immaterial language model, how do you think it reflects in, architecture, and what are your thoughts about it?
Yeah, I mean, what I would say is that there was a big contention going on back in '56 when they coined the term artificial intelligence, and they wanted to split from cybernetics. And that was why John McCarthy had to coin a new phrase. I mean, he was never very happy with the term AI. I mean, and I personally, because of the danger of anthropomorphizing, I think it's a very bad term. And also, it's not artificial. It's maybe synthetic, but it's not artificial. So that was certainly there. And Theo in the AA asked me a very similar question about embodied intelligence. And I was left thinking, well, how can intelligence be necessarily embodied? But as you were talking, I was just thinking, well, maybe I think this is maybe where the digital twin is going to be so significant, because there are sensors that are actually sensing the physical world of a building or a city and so on. And I'm just wondering whether it's going to give it some superiority because you're getting some feedback from the world around it. And that's always been the kind of the question. And I think if you think about neuroscience, I mean, the standard critique of AI is precisely that. In a sense, the argument within the world of neuroscience, and I'm blanking on the name of the guy from Chile who was the primary theorist of this thing, but is basically that human beings develop their intelligence through the outside world. And part of the problem is that when we're born, and it's partly to do with the fact that we've got such a big head, we're not actually born fully formed like most creatures. We have to, over the first few months, years of our lives, actually still develop, whereas other creatures can immediately see turtles swimming in the sea or whatever. We can't do that. So, and it's precisely interaction with our environment that's causing that intelligence. So, it's a good question. All I can say, I'm not quite sure the answer. You definitely need feedback. And I think this is precisely the problem of why processing is not very convincing compared to the logic of swarm intelligence. It is not swarm intelligence because, a slime mold is responding to its environment. Whereas processing, I mean, I don't know if you tried, well, you must have tried it, right? You try and blank out certain things, it just ignores it and so on. You don't really get proper feedback from the environment. All I can say is a good question. I got to think about that one. What do you think? What do you think?
Well,
maybe I'll answer it.
I mean, I like this is turning into a discussion, but I mean, I don't think anyone has like an actual answer, but I just from my readings, I tend to kind of on background from MIT, we had like this discussions on embodied intelligence and kind of like I mean, from my influences and readings, I tend to believe that body is important, right, in intelligence. Now, I guess AI could have a connection to a body through like a robotic entity or some kind of like physical form. So I don't know.
Yeah, you could certainly simulate. I mean, I don't know if I mentioned it, but Antonio Damasio he was actually a pupil of one of the big figures in AI. Anyway, he had an early background in AI, and he really rejects AI precisely for those same reasons. That you've got to have some feedback from the body itself and to do with emotions and feelings in his context. But yeah.
The question is if AI is really connected to a body, like a technological body, could it be equivalent to a kind of actual body? And could it learn from that body eventually?
Yeah, I don't think it's so important, but then maybe I'm not going to answer straight away, but yeah.
Okay, so actually I want to follow up on this question and then we open up.
One from Zoom.
You have one out of
A question from Zoom.
okay. Yeah, okay.
Do you want to read out here?
But maybe Marcela wants to follow up.
Actually I wanna, yes, okay, I use this one. Again, thank you for the great lecture. So I want to go back to some of the points. I think that, at the end, talking about the brain city, and actually you touched to, historically to how the urban paradigms have evolved, let's say in the last 20 years, starting from the smart city to the sentient city, to what I think now we start to expand this notion of brain city to this notion of cognition. And this is highly linked with neuroscience. So I'm really glad you mentioned that because I think we cannot really understand how city functions to really begin to connect how the brain works, but also how the field of neuroscience is highly impacting urbanism as well. So I'm really glad you touched on that and this connection, because I think we start to bring in this notion of cognition as a way in which we understand cognition as a production of knowledge. And I think this is the shift that we are experiencing now when we look at AI and the impact on the urban space. So in the, 20 years ago, when we talk about smart cities, there is in a way, it's completely top down, right? So we start to look at how even companies begin to control data, and how this data controls certain type of infrastructure in cities. And data then are sold to, this. So there is a high level of control when we talk about smart city. Sentient city really talks about, in a way, is how the cities function as this equipment of sensor and actuators that start to create a feedback loop. But when we talk about AI and the brain and the notion of cognition, we talk about completely something different that you touched upon. And so I think there is this notion of how the brain functions, but also how the city constantly learns. And this notion of learning through not top down, but learning from interaction, this to me is the big shift that we are experiencing. And the learning comes from the system, but the learning comes from people as well. And so in a way, we feed the city through this constant interaction, even between people, among people in general, right? So the city, it starts to shift this paradigm from how we conceive a city that is constantly learning because it's cognitive, because it's not able to produce knowledge, but also is able to interact with people or agent, different type of agents in order to produce new knowledge. So how, and you touch on this, so how this completely shift not how the city will look like, but how city will function and operate and perform. But my question is, in this, let's say framework where it's not really, we don't care about how really city look like, but how city will operate and perform, how would that impact livability and urbanity? This to me is also a very important question, because in the end comes down to people as well. So how we live in the urban environment, but also how AI might impact urbanity, for instance. And urbanity has nothing to do how city look like, but how city are the, let's say, framework for people or the background for people to live together. And this is highly connected to the notion of livability for the future. So I know it's a lot of layers, but I think.
Yeah. There's a lot there. I'm not sure I could answer it. I mean, I just a kind of general comment is I think the cognitive science has displaced. I mean, certainly, when I was at the AA, we were all talking about Deleuze and things, and forget that. That's not the paradigm of thinking these days. It's kind of it's neuroscience, it's AI. And if there is any philosophy, it's the kind of work that Andy Clark is doing. And it seems to me that is absolutely the key to moving on. Although there's still something in Deleuze, and I thought it's kind of interesting. Yeah. So the other thing I didn't mention, you alerted me that the fact is that Tesla might be producing all this information for themselves, but they're not sharing it. So until we get that point where you're actually totally sharing this information, you're not going to be getting anything that's going to be a kind of operating with its emergent capabilities. In terms of livability, I mean, I think that maybe it's not so complicated. Maybe it's just if you solve the traffic problems, that automatically makes things better. But I do think it's to do with, I think we as architects, we don't think about the city in terms of buildings, but it's ultimately about people and the people negotiating those buildings. So I'm not answering your question really, except to say that I think we're going to see. I think one of the things you get with any of these technologies is that you can develop the technology, but the way in which people creatively use that technology is something totally unpredictable. I mean, the cell phone was initially meant for rich businessmen, right? And that's what they thought the market would be. Then the rich businessmen gave it to their daughters who were going out in the evening and said, just give me a call, I'll come and pick you up later. And so suddenly you increase the market and you've got a different demography of people doing that. And then as soon as you get Uber, you're ordering Uber from your cell phone, which again was unpredictable. Those things will happen. So I'm not sure what we'll find, but I think we'll find, I mean, I'm optimistic there'll be some interesting things coming out from this that will completely change and make the world much more easy and inhabitable. And I think that the general logic of technology anyway is to make things easier. If you think I swipe an iPhone, I mean, the technology gets more and more advanced, but more and more easy to use. So I suspect that's where we're going to find the change. But I'm not sure I could predict what's going to happen. But yeah. It's a question from.
I think we can go here first, and then so any questions?
Yeah.
Yes, we have a couple of questions.
Do you want to come up here and ask them, because then they can hear it on Zoom?
It's okay, we can. This is but go ahead.
Okay, so my question is sort of surrounding the topic of spatial inclusivity and accessibility in terms of like marginalized populations, specifically like disability and race. So sort of feeding off of the previous questions, the questions are sort of, who does AI like consider as like a body if it itself has no body? Because obviously if it's responding to you, it's giving you answers thinking that you're a teenage girl, but then it becomes a question of like, okay, if I'm trying to design a city or ideate some sort of concept that responds to all these different populations, you have to think about like, okay, well, if this site is located in like the Middle East, or if this site is located in the Netherlands, like the community that you're sort of reaching out to is very, very different. And if AI has an unconscious bias, then how does it sort of create a future city? And then the data from which
Is that the second question? Or?
it's leading into the second question. The first question is like, who does AI consider a body if it itself carries no body?
Okay, can I answer that question first?
Sure.
So, because I'll probably forget it. So, I mean, AI is just based on the data, right? And that's kind of problematic. The bias, I mean, it may be that there are certain mechanisms that are exacerbating or even mitigating the bias, I don't know. But the bias comes from us because the data comes from us. So, you know, if you go online and you look for a nurse, you're probably going to get a female person, right? And all this. Now, what is interesting about AI is, which is actually, it is embedded in a context, which is really kind of strange. So anyone who's been using Midjourney might have discovered this. I found out when someone said, oh, do a house extension for me. Now, I didn't know that house extension is a British expression, right? So I inputted house extension. I kept getting this British buildings and gloomy weather. And I thought, this is really strange. And I discovered that in the States, you don't use the expression house extension. So you get this kind of embedded information that's coming out because it's completely contextualized. So also, and I've been using, in fact, some of the images I showed you at the very beginning, I actually use an indigenous artist from Australia who uses beautiful colors. But then I get Australian outback, you know, with these Australian gum trees and things coming out, plus this beautiful light comes out from it. Or if I input the name of I once tried an indigenous Inuit artist from Northern Canada. And I just mentioned the name, and I was about a building, and the building was covered in snow. And it gets all this coming at it, which means that actually prompts are absolutely totally impossible. So we have this expression prompt engineering, which means kind of gives the impression this is very objective, this is very engineering. Like it's not. It's like alchemy. You get this complete contextualized mess, and the same happens in the way that we think. Actually, we are also associative thinkers. So if you see a cooker and there's a red hob that you know, don't touch it because it's going to be hot. You know, or indeed, you know, vision is contaminated in some way by my other sort of associate. If I was to look at a cake, I know what it tastes like, you know, and I think you think about sort of like Proust, the Madeleine cake moment when he suddenly gets transported back to his childhood because he tastes these Madeleine cakes. I think that's how we also operate. So basically, it gets its data, and the data is contextualized and situated, but it's very difficult to deal with because it comes with all its associations. So, yeah, sorry.
I think that also partially answers the second question, which was if the data is biased or corrupt, then like how do we know that the entire system upon which it's based upon is not corrupt and therefore not something we should be following?
Well, I think we could potentially calibrate that data and rectify those things. I'm not an expert in that area. But it is an issue. It is an issue. But everyone points at AI, but actually it's from us. That's a real problem. I mean, there are a whole bunch of other questions not that you were answering, but I think in terms of copyright and a lot of assumptions that it's just cribbing other people's work. Well, I mean, understanding on top of what you're saying, but I mean, it doesn't copy. You know, AI never copies anything. You know, I did an exercise once with about 10,000 images based on Mises' Barcelona Pavilion. I never got a copy of it any once. But human beings copy. We all copy. You know, a bit like someone wearing Nike shoes, someone wear them next week, kind of thing. We all sort of copy. That's where we operate. And in fact, copyright is a very, very difficult question to deal with. The only obvious contravention is when you take copyrighted material and you scrape it from the internet. So you didn't ask that question. That's a kind of felt. There are a lot of other things that come in when you start engaging.
We have one more question there.
Do you want to come up?
Yes, Harsh.
Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and glimpse of your perspective on philosophy of AI. So more than a question, it's a curiosity to know your thoughts upon that. How far are we to that particular threshold to giving power to AI and then stepping back and interpreting that data so that it is context and case relevant, especially when it comes to architecture and urbanism. so that it remains relevant to the case specific objects or cases.
So could you explain that, what remains relevant to the case? Can you expand upon that?
For example, if I'm working on some particular thing, how far are we to the threshold that we give power to AI and we take it back to interpret what AI has given us in some while working on some very specific case. It's like Midjourney gives us this very cool and abstract renders, like it's very awesome to see. But how far are we that AI understands that, okay, this is viable and this is not?
Well, I mean, it's got no intentionality. That's the point right now, which is probably a good thing. So it's just kind of doing whatever we tell it to do. As soon as it starts developing intentionality, then it can take on a life of its own. You know, and I think certainly down the road, I mean, the whole process of design is going to be automated. And Wendy, who is doing it, is keeping, I know what she thinks actually, but she keeps quiet about it because basically it's going to lead to a lot of job redundancy for sure. But I mean, where was I going with that? Sorry. Yeah, at the moment, you know, it can do certain things and it automates certain things, and it soon will be able to pick up on our particular tastes, right? I mean, it does already in terms of the news. It's feeding us the news we want, or it's feeding us the music we want on Spotify, and Amazon's giving you the books you want to read and so on. It's already doing that. It's going to not take long before it's going to be there. And it's be able to kind of customize our aesthetic tastes, architectural tastes, and come up with things that it knows that we like. At the moment, there's very little feedback in these Midjourney systems. So there is on LookX, that's one that does have a feedback system and it collates that information, but most of it doesn't do that. I had another thought that came in my mind. And I blanked on it. Yeah, okay, just one comment really about Midjourney. In fact, it is really difficult to control. I don't know if you tried this. I mean, so there are people, there's, we have on Digital Futures, if anyone wants to find out about these things, there's a whole series of tutorials that we're doing on Digital Futures. And if you just go to digitalfutures.international, you can get to the YouTube thing and see all these things. But we had a guy called Carlos Bannon who's using ControlNet. And a lot of people are using different sort of supplementary software to try and control it and make sense of it. But AI itself is really difficult to control. And you're left kind of constrained by the affordances of the thing itself. In other words, it's good at some things and not at others. I mean, so I thought, oh, it's doing Mies van der Rohe's Barcelona Pudding. That's great. I tried Sydney Opera House and it just was horrible. You know, it just didn't do anything. I mean, and you've probably noticed that people are doing all these kind of inflatables and puffer jackets and things. That's because it does those very well, but there's some things it doesn't do. So you end up sort of like going the direction it's going and giving up on certain things. And of course, that works also with the names of the architects that you're working with. You know, if you've got a very unusual name that's got a big profile on the internet, like Jack Ingalls or Zaha Hadid, then it works. But if your name is John Smith, I'm not quite sure what the Indian equivalent of that would be, but it doesn't work at all. So it's at the moment, it's really, really imperfect. And it just can throw up surprising examples. And you do something, you generate something, and you say, oh, that looks like a swimming pool or something. And you say, you post it on Instagram, this is a swimming pool. But actually, you probably put a prompt in for something completely different. So at the moment, it's very, very, I'm not very good at doing things. And I don't think you're ever going to get to the point where it will be that good because of the comment I made before about associations. It is so murky, and trying to get it to go right is, I mean, like, you know, you saw the things I was showing early on. In that prompt, there is a reference to a zebra. Would you, I mean, and I put zebra in there because it gets good black and white contrast, but it literally, you develop this by alchemy, and it really works for some things and not for others. And I don't think it's going to be at the point just yet where it's going to really be able to come up with something that's very coherent and comprehensive, but it soon will be.
Thank you. So we go to a question on Zoom.
I'm going to just read it to you. I guess. Yeah, I want to try to change it. I'll screw it up. I wonder if as architects incorporate AI algorithms into the creative process, how does this collaboration between human ingenuity and machine intelligence provoke philosophical inquiries into the essence of creativity itself, questioning where the boundaries lie between human inspiration and artificial generation. Furthermore, in the philosophical discourse surrounding architectural aesthetics, how does the integration of AI-driven design elements in the brain city challenge or redefine traditional concepts of beauty, symmetry, and the sensory experience of urban spaces?
Right. That opens a real can of worms. And I'm going to give a paper in Suzhou on creativity. I mean, the question, I mean, to my mind, what is interesting about AI is when it becomes a mirror in which you can begin to understand what it is to be human. You know, and I think one of the questions that Stephen Wolfram makes, and he has a little book on ChatGPT, and what basically happens with ChatGPT is that it's actually only predicting the next word in the sentence. That's all it's doing. The Google model, it predicts a missing word in the sentence, but basically just predicting a word. And out of that, all this stuff occurs. And what Stephen Wolfram says, well, maybe that suggests that maybe human language is not so complicated. Maybe it's not as tough as we think. And I personally think that, you know, you almost start a sentence, you're searching around for the next word in the sentence, a bit like ChatGPT, and that's largely how it works. Or indeed, you know, it's based on a context base. What would you say in this situation? That's what basically it's looking for, you know. Or when it comes to designing, what would you do to design a kitchen? What does a kitchen look like? And we almost, I think it's very similar to how we work. And increasingly, there are differences, but I'm seeing more and more similarities between them. The big question about creativity, and this is why I'm really provocative, and people hate me for this. Okay, so let me just kind of like get a bunch of enemies in New York. But you know, the question is so there was this very famous game of Go, AlphaGo, where DeepMind in London produced a system that took on Lee Sedol of Korea, who was the kind of really the star Go player. And of course, what happened? It was operating at a level we just didn't understand. You know, there's a video I sometimes show of the commentators that said, "Well, that was a mistake. That was a mistake." It wasn't. You know, AlphaGo was able to make moves 100 moves ahead, and win the game by being so much more advanced than we are. And the comment that Lee Sedol came up with after the match was that AlphaGo showed us moves that we thought were creative were actually quite conventional, which means that, well, there are two things there. One is, was it being creative? If you're a machine, can you be creative? And actually, I'm doing that thing, trying to search for the name now. Melanie Mitchell thinks that you can't be creative unless you've got consciousness, because you're not aware you're being creative. Well, of course, if you're working with Midjourney, there's a human in the loop, and therefore you can be. But can AI be creative on it in and of itself? And if you take the view it's just simply a mechanical process that's just searching for an optimal solution, then I would say no. But then you think, well, what about humans? Now, creativity is a very interesting concept. I mean, and I want to devote a book to that at some stage because it's so problematic. I mean, there have been various objective attempts to objectively define creativity. Margaret Bowden started off on that, and she has got three, but actually they're kind of strategies for creativity. They're not real creativity. Demis Hassabis also talks about creativity. But the question ultimately is, how can you talk about creativity in such objective terms? Whose creativity? No? And what if, say, you're Van Gogh and you're producing something that nobody recognized in your lifetime? Is that creative? You know, and I increasingly come to the impression that form the impression that creativity is in the eye of the beholder, or in the mind of the person thinking they're being creative. In other words, it's not objective. It's like beauty. Creativity is like beauty, which then leads to the kind of the interesting kind of question. So creativity is in the eye of the beholder. And then, okay, so here's the other thing. Okay, well, so Lee Sedol says things we thought were creative. Now, this is where I would go back to Arthur C. Clarke, who he says there's no such thing as magic, and I agree with that. And Margaret Bowden says that creativity is not magical. The question ultimately, in my mind, is whether creativity is creative at all, and whether actually we're not just doing precisely what the computer's doing and just searching for the optimal solution, except we're not as efficient as the computer in doing that. So, you know, I think you could even argue that the creativity is a complete myth. We are not actually creative. We just call it that because we think it is, but we haven't got round to understanding what it is. A bit like emergence. We haven't understood it fully. I had a long discussion with Andy Clark, who's this cognitive scientist that I know in Brighton, and we came to the agreement either computers and human beings are both creative, or neither are creative. I certainly know that Memo Acton thinks that computers can be creative, but it really raises some interesting questions. I don't think we're creative. I don't think that I think creative is like magic. It doesn't actually exist. We just call it that because we can't explain it, you know? So I went off on a tangent there, sorry.
No, it's interesting.
Yeah. I'm skeptical about creativity.
Next book.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's not a title for it, but yeah.
Are there any more questions from here, in person, audience, and online? Nidhi.
Hi.
Yeah, so my question is basically that I might not know a lot about AI like my fellow students in computational design, but according to what you said, that it analyzes data that has happened and what is to happen, it kind of tries to understand human interaction, not only with themselves, among themselves, but also with its environment. So when we're talking about urban design, we as urban designers think about designing cities way ahead of time. So do you really think, I would like to know your speculation as to how AI would actually help or become a tool? Because most of the solutions that AI gives, because of the lack of words, I might have to say temporary or short-lived. So in case we're thinking about years ahead, how will AI analyze this evolution of the needs and thoughts that we have in our growing cities?
Okay. I suspect that AI is going to be better than us at doing that. Certainly, I mean, there have been, in terms, I mean, cities are a very complex phenomena, right? I mean, and one of the problems is that we have a limited range of, as human beings, of capacity to deal with complex phenomena. And one of the things they've discovered is that certainly, even in the early use of SpaceMaker, AI was able to see things we couldn't see. It could see patterns in the data and come up with solutions that were seemingly counterintuitive, just like the kind of AlphaGo match. It was coming up with things that we wouldn't have thought about ourselves. So I see it that way eventually, that it's going to be that. At the moment, my way of looking at something like Midjourney is that we're very good at I mean, maybe I should explain that there is a thing called the GAN, Generative Adversarial Network, where there's two neural networks competing against each other. One is generating stuff and one is evaluating, one is a discriminator. And that's actually quite an interesting model for how we operate as architects and for some way, because when you're a designer, you need to get some feedback, some critical feedback to make sure that it's a good design. But I don't think that we actually have much imagination. I think we overvalue our imagination. I remember there was a review at the AA once where a student came along and said, I've looked at the possibilities and there's 6. Unlikely to be 6, right? The next guy comes in, who's a very talented guy, one of Cira's students, and he said, I looked at the possibilities and I ran them through the computer and there are 654 of them. And to be honest, 552 of them look all the same, but here they are. You know, I don't think we have the capacity to really search through for those options. What we are really good at is discriminating, is judging these things. Now, I was at a bar last night and I had a cocktail, right? If you go to, you sip a cocktail, immediately you know if you like it or not. If you smell a perfume, immediately. You look at an image, immediately. You know, we're actually very good at that. So what's happening is actually, it's enhancing what we're bad at, which is actually imagination. It's expanding the range of possibilities, and it's coming up with things that we wouldn't have done ourselves, and therefore it's enhancing us. And they've already shown, there was some research done in a Harvard review, that those using ChatGPT could significantly outperform those who are not using ChatGPT. It was quite stunning, the result, in some ways. So I think it's going to be enhancing us in general sort of terms. You know, and I think it's going to be looking for patterns, finding patterns in the data in the future that we wouldn't have been thinking about either. So I would actually put my trust in AI in terms of the future of how we're going to be operating. But does that answer your question? There was something else about your question I haven't answered.
Analyze evolution, because that's something that we see, right? We see growing cities, something that even as urban designers, we can't really predict. You know, how is AI going to do a better job than us?
Predicting. Well, we predict, right? I mean, that's fundamental to the brain, what the brain does. It's one of Ray Kurzweil's points. I just, no, I actually, I believe that when it comes to those kind of things, I mean, just, you need to see this AlphaGo, watch the documentary AlphaGo, because then you sort of begin to realize, holy shit, this is incredible what it can do and how it can predict, you know, because if you're a Go player, you might predict 1 or 2 moves ahead. And this thing was predicting 100 moves ahead, you know, and I know that in I don't know, well, in the West, we don't play Go. So this game had no impact on us. In China, where half the population watched that match, it had it changed the way they thought about things. 2016, they saw this match, and it's called the Sputnik moment. Sputnik is when the Soviets launched Sputnik to space, and the Americans realized they were behind and said, okay, we've got to get NASA going, right? And in China, they saw this, and President Xi gave a speech saying, by 2025, we have to overtake the Americans in this. This is the important thing. So, you know, I think that it's going to be a game changer, especially in those complex predictive questions, especially to do with urban context. That would be my hunch. I'm not an urbanist, but I wouldn't doubt it. I would be convinced by it. Yeah.
Thank you again. We look forward to see what's going to happen in the future.
Can I just tell you one thing's going to happen in the future, okay? Yes. So when I was working on AI the first time around, my first book, I felt very compromised because it was both good and bad. I felt like Elon Musk. You know, Elon Musk is telling us that he's obviously working with AI, and yet he's terrified by it. I'm exactly the same as him. So I went back to my publishers, Bloomsbury, and I said, listen, can I do 2 books on AI? You know, one with a white cover about how nice AI is, how great it is, and one with a black cover. This is going to be the Black Mirror episode of it, right? So it's going to, and I was going to put that off, right? I was going to put that off. I want to write some nice books first, but it seems like the dark side is actually coming upon us sooner than we thought. And well, all I can say is that I don't know if you know this, but you're from Italy, right? I translated Alberti from Latin into English. So that was my first ever book. And Alberti gave us the definition of the architect, right? Somebody who was running the show, in charge of everything. On the first page of the first book published on architecture, there it was, 1450, roughly that. Arguably, AI is going to be the end of that. I mean, it's not just because of AI. I think the profession's struggling already. I mean, certainly in the UK, we are not in charge. I mean, less than 50%, more than 50% of the contracts are now design build, where the architect's working for the developer. So already the profession is slipping and slipping and slipping. And I can see reasons why it's going to slip even further. All I can say is sorry? Or redefine. I think it'll mutate and change for sure, definitely. But I know the final sentence, my black book, right? Because architecture began with Alberti. And I think it's going to end with AI. And by a curious coincidence, Alberti's name begins with A and ends in I.
Great. Thank you again.
Sure. Keep calm and carry it. You want to get both, right? Or against that one in the corner. It's really low. Might be, but still slightly.